the young world continued its slow turning, bathed in the light of a younger, dimmer sun. Vast oceans, now calmer than in their first fiery days, stretched across the face of the planet, deep and dark and holding secrets within their depths. The water wasn't empty, not truly. It was a thin soup, a gentle broth stirred by slow currents and warmed from below by the planet's own inner heat, especially near the cracks and vents in the ocean floor where plumes of mineral-rich warmth rose like smoke from hidden chimneys. Dissolved within this water were countless tiny pieces, the building blocks we spoke of, molecules drifting and tumbling, bumping gently into one another in the endless, silent dance of chemistry. For ages upon ages, this was the way of things. Water, rock, faint sunlight filtering down, and the quiet mingling of chemicals. Nothing hurried, nothing rushed. Time flowed like the deep ocean currents, immeasurably slow. Imagine that deep, quiet water, stretching for miles and miles, down into darkness where sunlight never reached. It was a world waiting, though it did not know it was waiting, it simply was. The ingredients were there, floating freely, like specks of dust catching a stray sunbeam in a quiet room. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, all the little bits and pieces needed for something new, swirling gently in the watery cradle of the early Earth. And then, somewhere in that vastness, perhaps near a warm, mineral-rich vent, perhaps in a shallow, sun-warmed pool trapped among volcanic rocks, something almost impossibly subtle began to happen. It wasn't a sudden flash or a loud event. It was quieter than the quietest whisper, smaller than the smallest grain of sand. Among the endless bumping and jostling of molecules, certain types found they liked to stick together. Some molecules, the fatty kinds called lipids, had a curious property. One end of the molecule was drawn to water, while the other end tried to shy away from it. When enough of these gathered, they could arrange themselves, quite naturally, into a tiny, hollow sphere, a minuscule bubble. Imagine a bubble so small you could never hope to see it, far tinier than anything visible to our eyes. Inside this bubble, a tiny bit of the surrounding water was trapped, along with whatever dissolved molecules happened to be there at that moment. Outside, the vast ocean continued its slow dance. This bubble, this membrane, was a boundary. It was the very first hint of an inside distinct from the outside. It wasn't alive, not yet. It was just a consequence of chemistry, a tiny pocket of captured seawater. Think of it like a dewdrop clinging to a spider's thread, separate for a moment from the morning mist. These little bubbles, these protocells, were incredibly fragile. Most would have formed and broken apart in moments, their contents spilling back into the general soup. They were just fleeting arrangements of molecules. But chemistry is patient, and the ocean was vast, and time was almost endless. Countless trillions of these tiny bubbles must have formed and vanished, like thoughts flickering and fading. Yet, within some of these tiny, fragile spheres, something else might have happened, purely by chance. Perhaps the particular mix of molecules trapped inside was slightly different. Perhaps some of those molecules could attract other specific molecules from the water outside, drawing them through the thin, fatty wall of the bubble. Perhaps some molecules inside could react with each other, changing form, releasing a tiny bit of energy, or building slightly larger structures. It wasn't thinking, it wasn't trying, it was just chemistry, happening inside a confined space. If a bubble happened to trap molecules that could, say, attract more of the fatty lipids that made up its own wall, then the bubble might grow, just a little. If it happened to trap molecules that could encourage other simple molecules from the outside to come in and join together, forming something useful inside the bubble, then the collection of molecules inside would become slightly more complex. Think of these first little entities not as creatures, but as tiny, sleeping seeds adrift in the water. They weren't swimming or hunting or thinking. They were passive, drifting with the currents, utterly dependent on the molecules that happened to bump into them. They were like microscopic sacs, holding a slightly special mix of the ocean's chemical soup. Their aliveness was perhaps only a flicker, a slight tendency to persist, to maintain their structure, perhaps even to grow very, very slowly. The boundary was key. This simple membrane, this fatty film, allowed the inside to be different from the outside. It concentrated certain molecules, allowing reactions to happen more readily than they would in the open ocean where everything was diluted. It was like creating a tiny workshop protected from the vastness outside, where specific chemical processes could occur, however simple. And perhaps, just perhaps, within some of these growing bubbles, another threshold was crossed. As a bubble grew larger, its surface might become unstable. It might simply split into two smaller bubbles, each carrying a portion of the molecules that were inside the parent bubble. It wasn't reproduction in the way we know it now, with all its intricate dance of genetics. It was more like a soap bubble dividing, a simple physical process. But if the molecules inside each new daughter bubble also carried the ability to attract more materials, to grow, and eventually to split again, then something truly new had begun. This was the tiny spark, not a conscious act, but a chemical loop, a cycle, a structure that could gather resources, maintain itself, grow, and then divide, creating more structures like itself. It was the humblest beginning imaginable. These first life forms, if we can even call them that yet, were likely far simpler than the simplest bacteria we know today. They were perhaps little more than self-sustaining chemical reactions wrapped in a membrane. They didn't have complex machinery or intricate plans. They just persisted. They took in simple compounds from the water, perhaps dissolved chemicals near those warm deep-sea vents, or simpler molecules energized by the distant sun in shallower waters, and used them to maintain their tiny forms and, eventually, to split. Imagine them, these infinitesimal specks, scattered sparsely through the immense, ancient ocean. They would have been invisible, silent, drifting passively. They were like the very first, quiet notes of a symphony that would eventually swell to encompass the entire planet. They were the sleeping seeds, holding within their simple structures the potential for everything that was to come. They didn't know it. They couldn't know anything. They simply were, sustained by the gentle chemistry of the warm, early water. There was no sudden explosion of life. For millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of years, these incredibly simple forms might have been all there was. Just tiny bubbles of chemistry, growing and dividing, barely distinguishable from the non-living chemical reactions happening all around them. They were utterly vulnerable, easily destroyed, their existence precarious. Yet, they had one crucial advantage over mere chemistry: the ability, however crude, to make more of themselves. A chemical reaction happens, uses up its ingredients, and stops. But these tiny entities, if conditions were right, could potentially keep the process going, budding off copies, spreading ever so slowly. Think of the quiet patience of it all. The slow drift in the deep water, the gentle bumping of molecules, the formation and dissolution of countless bubbles, and among them, a few that found a way to hang on, to draw in sustenance from the water around them, to grow just enough to split, to become two where there was one. It was life at its absolute minimum, a faint pulse in the vast, quiet ocean. Like a seed buried deep in the soil, showing no sign of the tree it might become, these first forms held the blueprint, not yet written down, but inherent in their simple, repeating chemistry, for the grand, unfolding story of life on Earth. The water remained deep and largely silent, but now, hidden within it, tiny sparks had been kindled, waiting for time and chance to fan them into a slow, enduring flame. The journey had begun, not with a roar, but with the quietest, most subtle stirring in the ancient sea. The deep ocean cradled these first stirrings of life in darkness, a realm untouched by the warmth and brilliance of the distant sun. Down there, in the crushing pressure and the cold, energy was scarce, gleaned patiently from the chemical whispers emanating from volcanic vents or dissolved minerals drifting in the currents. Life existed as a slow, quiet hum, sustained by the Earth's own internal heat and chemistry. But far, far above, closer to the boundary between water and air, lay a different world. A world bathed in light. Imagine the surface of that ancient ocean. Sunlight, raw and unfiltered by the atmosphere we know today, poured down relentlessly. It warmed the upper layers, danced on the ripples, and pierced the clear water, sending shimmering shafts deep into the blue. For the earliest life forms huddled in the depths, this dazzling energy source was utterly remote, irrelevant, but the ocean is never still. Currents swirl, water mixes, and over immense stretches of time, some of those simple, replicating bubbles, those microscopic pioneers, would have inevitably drifted upwards, carried gently towards the light. Perhaps it was an accident at first, a random journey into shallower waters. For a creature evolved in darkness, the unfiltered sunlight might have even been dangerous, damaging its delicate structure. Yet, within the random shuffling of chemistry that drove early evolution, some cells might have possessed, purely by chance, molecules that offered a tiny bit of protection, absorbing some of the harsh rays. Or perhaps other molecules, already present, just happened to react subtly to the light, a flicker of change in their internal rhythm. Think of these tiny cells, suspended near the surface. Sunlight poured over them, an immense, untapped river of energy flowing past. The challenge, the great evolutionary puzzle, was how to tap into that river. How could a microscopic speck of life possibly harness the power of a star? It wouldn't happen through conscious effort, of course, but through the slow, patient filtering of chance. Countless variations would arise and vanish. But somewhere, sometime, a cell developed a molecule, a pigment, that did something remarkable. When light struck it, it didn't just absorb it passively. It captured a tiny spark of its energy, holding it for a fleeting moment. Perhaps these first light-sensitive molecules were simple, not very efficient. Maybe they only caught certain colors of light, letting the rest pass by. But even this tiny advantage could be significant. If that captured spark could be used, somehow, to fuel the cell's basic processes, to help it gather food, or repair itself, or divide, then that cell would have an edge. It could thrive in conditions where others struggled. It could replicate faster, passing on its light-catching trick to its descendants. Over unimaginable spans of time, this process refined itself. Natural selection favored cells with better pigments, molecules more attuned to capturing the sun's energy. These pigments gave the cells color. We don't know exactly what the very first ones looked like, but eventually, a particularly effective molecule emerged. One that absorbed red and blue light strongly, reflecting green light back. This molecule, chlorophyll, would become the cornerstone of a revolution. Cells containing it took on a greenish hue, the very color we now associate so strongly with life. But capturing light energy was only the first step. The captured energy needed to be put to work. The true genius, the chemical miracle that unfolded within these tiny organisms, was learning to use that captured sunlight to perform a kind of alchemy. They learned to take the most abundant substance around them, water, and use the sun's energy to break it apart. Think of it, using light to snap the strong bonds holding hydrogen and oxygen together in a water molecule. This act of splitting water achieved two crucial things. It released the hydrogen, which the cell could then combine with another plentiful substance dissolved in the water, carbon dioxide, the same gas we breathe out. Using the sunlight's energy as the binding force, the cell stitched hydrogen and carbon dioxide together to create sugars. Simple sugars, yes, but these were molecules packed with usable energy, food created seemingly out of light and water, and the faint fizz of dissolved gas. It was a way to store the sun's energy for later use, to fuel growth and replication. Life had learned to drink sunlight. And the second consequence of splitting water? Oxygen. For every water molecule broken, an oxygen atom was left over. These atoms paired up, forming oxygen gas, O2. For the cell itself, this oxygen was initially just a waste product, something to be released, expelled back into the water. Tiny bubbles of this invisible gas began to seep from these sun-feeding cells, rising slowly towards the surface. At first, it was an insignificant amount, quickly dissolving or reacting with minerals like iron dissolved in the seawater. The ocean acted like a vast sponge, soaking up this new substance. But the advantage gained by these photosynthetic cells, these sun drinkers, was immense. They were no longer limited to the scarce chemical energy sources found in the deep or near vents. As long as the sun shone, as long as there was water and dissolved carbon dioxide, they could make their own food. they were liberated. They could flourish in the vast sunlit expanses of the upper ocean, a habitat previously sparsely populated. And flourish they did. Imagine the change, happening not over days or years, but millennia. Slowly, inexorably, the populations of these green pigmented microbes swelled. Where before the surface waters might have held only scattered, drifting life, now they began to teem. These organisms, often single-celled cyanobacteria, sometimes called blue-green algae, spread across the globe. They formed vast communities, sometimes visible as greenish slicks or mats on the water's surface. In shallower areas, near coastlines or in lagoons, they might grow in thick layers, forming structures called stromatolites, living pillows of microbial life built up slowly over centuries, layer upon layer, each reaching for the light. This was the beginning of the world turning green. Not yet the green of forests and meadows, land plants were still hundreds of millions of years in the future, but the green of the oceans. Sunlight, which had previously just warmed the water and driven weather patterns, was now being systematically harvested by life on a planetary scale. The energy of the sun was being woven into the fabric of living things, fueling a bloom of existence unlike anything that had come before. Picture the scene. Endless stretches of ocean, shimmering under the ancient sun, and within that water, trillions upon trillions of microscopic green cells, each one a tiny engine turning light into life. Each one silently splitting water, building sugars, and releasing a minute puff of oxygen. It was a quiet revolution, carried out by the smallest of organisms, but its consequences were profound. The sheer scale of it is hard to comprehend. These were single cells, dividing and spreading, generation after generation, across millions of square miles of ocean surface for millions upon millions of years. The cumulative effect was staggering. The slow seep of oxygen, once easily absorbed by the environment, began to overwhelm the capacity of the oceans and rocks to soak it up. Slowly, painstakingly slowly, the concentration of oxygen in the water began to rise, and eventually, after aeons, it began to leak out of the oceans altogether, accumulating in the atmosphere above. This oxygen was a powerful substance. Highly reactive, it was actually toxic to many of the other early life forms that had evolved in the oxygen-free environment of the early Earth. Its buildup would cause one of the planet's first great extinction events, wiping out many anaerobic organisms, but it also created opportunities. This new, energy-rich gas would eventually fuel the evolution of respiration, the process that allows animals, including ourselves, to extract energy from food much more efficiently. The waste product of these tiny green cells would, in time, become the breath of life for much larger, more complex creatures. But that was all far in the future. For now, the story was one of success, of life finding a new and incredibly powerful way to sustain itself. The quiet, patient chemistry bubbling in the deep sea had found its way to the surface and learned to harness the power of the sun. The faint pulse of life had grown stronger, bolder, painting the vast, empty canvas of the sunlit ocean with shades of green and blue-green. The world was still mostly water, still mostly silent compared to the sounds of life today. But it was no longer just a passive recipient of sunlight. Life was actively engaging with its star, drinking in its energy, and in doing so, beginning to reshape the chemistry of the entire planet. The slow, enduring flame kindled in the deep had found a powerful new fuel, and it was beginning to burn brightly, casting a greenish glow across the waters of the young Earth. The stage was being set for the next, even more intricate, acts in the grand story of evolution. The waters shimmered under the ancient sun, teeming now with these tiny, industrious green cells, breathing out the sharp, invigorating air of oxygen. For ages upon ages, life had been a simple affair, contained within a single, small boundary, like a one-room dwelling where everything happened together. Inside these early cells, these prokaryotes, the vital essence of life, the delicate strands of genetic code, the tiny protein-building factories called ribosomes, the enzymes orchestrating the cell's chemistry, all floated freely in the internal sea of the cytoplasm. It was a bustling, open-plan existence. Efficient enough for a simple life, perhaps, But as the world changed, as oxygen levels rose, as competition subtly grew, this simple arrangement began to face new challenges. Imagine a tiny workshop where every tool, every blueprint, every raw material, and every finished product jostles together in the same space. It works, but it's easy for things to get mixed up, for delicate processes to be disturbed, for efficiency to be limited. And so, over immense stretches of quiet time, measured not in days or years but in the slow creep of millennia, a new kind of cellular architecture began to emerge, almost imperceptibly at first. It wasn't a sudden blueprint, but a gradual, tentative exploration of internal space. Picture the outer boundary of some of these ancient cells, the flexible membrane that held everything inside. Perhaps, through countless generations, tiny, random inward folds began to appear in this membrane, like gentle ripples turning inwards instead of outwards. These weren't dramatic events, more like slow, soft indentations deepening over time, pushing into the cell's interior. These enfoldings, drifting and billowing inwards, began to create secluded bays and inlets within the cell. They weren't solid walls, but rather extensions of the outer boundary, creating pockets and channels, partitioning the internal environment. It was as if the single-room workshop was slowly developing alcoves and screened-off areas. One of the most profound developments began when some of these inward-folding membranes started to gather around the cell's precious genetic material, its DNA. Imagine these delicate sheets of membrane, slowly, carefully enveloping the vital strands that held the instructions for life. They wrapped around the DNA, layer upon layer perhaps, forming a protective, double-walled sanctuary right in the heart of the cell. This wasn't a rapid construction, but a process refined over countless generations, favored because it offered a crucial advantage: safety. Inside this newly formed compartment, the nucleus, the DNA was shielded from the increasingly busy and potentially disruptive chemistry happening in the main body of the cell, especially the reactive oxygen molecules that were becoming more common. It became a quiet library, a secure vault where the master blueprints could be stored, read, and carefully copied without interference. The cell now had a dedicated control center, a serene space from which to manage its affairs. This was a profound shift, the birth of the eukaryotic cell, a cell with a true nucleus. But the internal partitioning didn't stop there. These enfolding membranes, connected in intricate ways, continued to elaborate, creating a whole network of channels and flattened sacs spreading throughout the cytoplasm. This network, the endoplasmic reticulum, became like a vast internal workshop connected to the nucleus. One part, studded with those tiny protein factories, the ribosomes, became the rough ER, a dedicated production line, where proteins destined for specific jobs or for export from the cell could be assembled according to the instructions sent out from the nuclear library. Another part, the smooth ER, lacking ribosomes, specialized in different tasks, like making lipids or detoxifying harmful substances. Quiet, specialized laboratories tucked away within the cell's growing complexity. Nearby, another set of membrane-bound sacs formed, stacked like flattened pouches, the Golgi apparatus. Think of it as the cell's post office or finishing school. Proteins and lipids arriving from the ER would enter the Golgi, where they might be further modified, sorted, tagged with molecular addresses, and carefully packaged into tiny membrane-bound bubbles called vesicles. These vesicles would then bud off, ready to deliver their contents to the correct destination, whether elsewhere within the cell or even outside its boundaries. The open-plan workshop was transforming into a highly organized facility with dedicated departments for manufacturing, finishing, and shipping. Everything was becoming more orderly, more controlled. While these internal membranes were creating new levels of organization, another, perhaps even more remarkable transformation was quietly unfolding, driven by the challenge and opportunity presented by that abundant, energy-rich oxygen. Many early cells struggled with oxygen. It was potent, reactive, potentially damaging. But some smaller, simpler prokaryotic cells had evolved ways to handle it, to use its power safely and efficiently to generate energy. They were like tiny specialists in oxygen respiration. Now, imagine one of the larger, newly organizing cells, perhaps one that already had a nucleus and the beginnings of an internal membrane system, encountering one of these smaller, oxygen-using microbes. Perhaps, initially, the larger cell simply engulfed the smaller one, intending to digest it as food. This engulfing, called phagocytosis, was likely becoming a more common feeding strategy as cells grew larger and more complex. But what if, sometimes, the digestion didn't happen? What if the smaller cell, instead of being broken down, survived inside the larger one? Picture this tiny microbe, now sheltered within the cytoplasm of its host, continuing to do what it did best, breathing oxygen and releasing energy. The host cell, in turn, provided a safe environment and perhaps a steady supply of fuel molecules. It wasn't a conquest, but the beginning of a partnership, an intimate cohabitation forged over unimaginable lengths of time. The engulfed cell, protected and nourished, provided its host with a huge advantage, a vastly more efficient way to generate energy from food using oxygen, far surpassing what the host cell could manage on its own. The host, benefiting from this abundant energy supply, could thrive, grow larger, and support more complex internal structures. Over countless generations, this partnership became permanent, deeply integrated. The engulfed bacterium gradually lost many of its own genes, becoming entirely dependent on its host. But it retained the essential machinery for respiration and even kept a tiny remnant of its own DNA, a whisper of its independent past. These internalized specialists became the mitochondria, the powerhouses of the eukaryotic cell. They were no longer just guests, but essential components. Tiny, smoothly humming engines distributed throughout the cell, constantly converting fuel and oxygen into the readily usable energy currency the cell needed for all its activities. They safely handled the potent fire of oxygen, transforming its danger into life-giving power. Nearly all complex cells, including those that would eventually build animals and fungi, adopted these indispensable power plants. And in some lineages of these early eukaryotes, another, similar event took place. Imagine a eukaryotic cell, already equipped with a nucleus and mitochondria, engulfing a different kind of specialist, one of those cyanobacteria, the descendants of the very cells that had first filled the world with oxygen. These cyanobacteria were masters of photosynthesis, able to capture the energy of sunlight and convert it into chemical energy. Again, perhaps the initial encounter was predatory, but just as with the ancestor of the mitochondrion, sometimes the engulfed cyanobacterium wasn't digested. It survived within the host cell, finding shelter and stability, and in return, it offered an incredible gift: the ability to make its own food directly from sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide. The host cell, now harboring these tiny green solar panels, no longer needed to hunt or scavenge for all its energy needs. It could simply bask in the sunlit waters and create its own sustenance. This second act of endosymbiosis, this nesting of a photosynthetic bacterium within a host cell, also became permanent over vast eons. The engulfed cyanobacterium, like the mitochondrian's ancestor, streamlined its functions, shed unnecessary genes, and became utterly reliant on its host. It became the chloroplast. These organelles, filled with chlorophyll, gave rise to the algae and eventually the plants. They became the internal greenhouses, capturing the sun's energy, driving the great cycles of life on Earth from within the protected confines of the eukaryotic cell. Like mitochondria, chloroplasts also retained a tiny fragment of their own circular DNA, another echo of their free-living origins. So now, the cell was no longer just a simple bag. It had become a marvel of internal architecture, a bustling yet orderly microscopic city. It had a secure central library, the nucleus, sprawling factory floors, and specialized workshops, the ER, a sophisticated processing and packaging center, the Golgi, numerous efficient power plants, the mitochondria, and, in some cases, internal solar energy collectors, the chloroplasts. All these compartments, these organelles, allowed for specialization, efficiency, and control on a scale previously impossible. Processes could happen in dedicated spaces, shielded from interference. Energy could be generated abundantly and safely. Complex molecules could be built, modified, and transported with precision. This internal complexity, these cozy rooms built inside the cell, represented a monumental leap in the story of life. It allowed cells to become much larger, to manage far more intricate internal processes, and to interact with their environment in more sophisticated ways. The simple, open-plan existence of the prokaryote had given way to the compartmentalized, highly organized world of the eukaryote. This new cellular structure, born from membrane folding and ancient partnerships, provided the essential foundation upon which all larger, more complex forms of life, the fungi, the plants, the animals, would eventually be built. The stage, once set with simple cells harnessing sunlight, was now populated by actors with vastly increased internal capabilities, ready for the next act, the tentative, extraordinary journey towards multicellularity. The quiet hum of mitochondria and the gentle, light gathering of chloroplasts within these intricate cellular homes marked not an end, but a profound new beginning. The hum inside these intricate cells was indeed a new beginning, a quiet revolution contained within microscopic walls. For a long, long time, even after acquiring their internal libraries and power stations and solar panels, these complex eukaryotic cells continued their existence, much as their simpler ancestors had, alone. Each cell was a self-sufficient island, drifting through the water, or perhaps nestled in the damp earth, encountering others mostly by chance, as competitors for sunlight or food, or perhaps as potential meals. They were miniature universes, bustling within, but solitary travelers in the vastness of the world. Imagine them, countless tiny specks of intricate life, floating in the sunlit layers of ancient oceans, each a masterpiece of internal organization, yet fundamentally alone. The world was immense, and a single cell, no matter how complex inside, remained very small, very vulnerable. But life, in its quiet, persistent way, is always exploring possibilities. It nudges at boundaries, tries variations, and sometimes stumbles upon something new, not through grand design, but through simple, almost accidental proximity. Think of bubbles blown from soapy water. Sometimes they float off individually, perfect spheres catching the light, and sometimes they gently bump and cling together, sharing a delicate, shimmering wall. Perhaps it began like that for the cells. Maybe, after a cell divided, meticulously copying its internal wonders and splitting into two daughter cells, the final separation wasn't quite complete. A tiny strand of the outer membrane, a shared bit of the sugary coat that many cells wore, might have remained, holding the two new cells together like unwilling twins. Or perhaps some cells, through a tiny mutation, a slight change in their genetic instructions, developed an outer surface that was just a little bit sticky. Not intentionally sticky, not reaching out, but just adhesive, like a burr clinging softly to fur. In the beginning, this sticking together might have been nothing more than a nuisance, two cells tethered when they might have preferred to drift apart. But in the slow, patient theater of evolution, even small, accidental changes can have unforeseen consequences. Perhaps being a slightly larger clump of 2 or 4 or 8 cells made it just a little bit harder for some predator, itself perhaps only a slightly larger single cell, to engulf them. A tiny advantage in staying alive. Or maybe, clinging together allowed a small group of cells to anchor themselves more effectively in a gentle current, staying put in a place where sunlight was plentiful or nutrients were rich, while solitary cells were swept away. Imagine a shallow, sun-warmed pool. Single cells drift lazily, but here and there, small clusters remain, clinging to a submerged rock or a strand of algae. They aren't trying to stay together. They simply are together, and because of this, they remain in the good spot. Over time, the cells that have this tendency to stick, however slight, might leave behind more descendants in that favorable location. It wasn't a decision, not a plan, just the quiet filtering process of nature favoring what works, even if it works only marginally better. And so, these accidental clumps, these loosely associated groups, began to appear more often. Sometimes they formed simple chains, like strings of tiny beads swaying in the water. Sometimes they grew into flat sheets, a single layer of cells lying side by side like paving stones. Other times, perhaps through repeated divisions where cells remained attached on all sides, they formed more three-dimensional clusters, little balls of life. They weren't yet truly multicellular organisms in the way we think of a plant or an animal. Often, each cell in the clump was still perfectly capable of surviving on its own if broken away. They were more like friendly neighbors living very close together, perhaps sharing a garden fence. But living closely inevitably leads to interactions. The cells on the outside of a clump experience the world differently from those nestled deep inside. The outer cells felt the direct warmth of the sun, the flow of water carrying nutrients past, and also the potential dangers of the environment. The inner cells were more sheltered, buffered from the outside world, but perhaps received less direct sunlight, or had to rely on nutrients diffusing inwards past their neighbors. This difference in experience, repeated generation after generation over immense stretches of time, could begin to subtly shape the cells. Perhaps the outer cells, constantly exposed, developed slightly tougher outer walls, or became more adept at capturing sunlight. Perhaps the inner cells, shielded and stable, became more efficient at processing stored energy, or at the process of cell division itself. It wasn't a conscious choice, but rather that cells with slight variations suited to their position within the clump were more likely to thrive and pass on those traits. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the first whispers of cooperation began. Imagine a cluster where the outer cells developed tiny whip-like tails, flagella, just like some single-celled organisms used for movement. If these outer cells began to beat their flagella in a somewhat coordinated way, perhaps triggered by light or a chemical signal, the entire clump could begin to move, purposefully, towards a brighter spot or away from a harmful substance. The inner cells, without flagella, benefited from this movement without expending the energy to create or operate the tails themselves. In return, perhaps the inner cells were better at storing food reserves that could benefit the whole group during lean times. This wasn't a complex division of labor yet, nothing like the specialized cells in our own bodies. It was simpler, more fluid, but it was the beginning of teamwork. It was the first time that cells within a single group began to do slightly different jobs for the benefit of the whole. To hold the group together more firmly, some cells began to secrete sticky substances, proteins and sugars that formed a shared scaffolding, an extracellular matrix. Think of it as a delicate, transparent jelly holding the cells in place, a shared substance that defined the boundary of the colony, their collective home. This shared matrix could also help in communication, allowing chemical signals to pass more easily between neighbors, coordinating their simple actions. Consider the beautiful example of volvox, a type of green algae that exists today, but gives us a glimpse into how these early steps might have looked. Volvox forms a stunning hollow sphere, composed of thousands of cells embedded in a shared gelatinous matrix. Each cell on the outer surface has two flagella, all beating in coordination to roll the sphere through the water, seeking the light for photosynthesis. Inside the sphere, protected from the outside world, are specialized reproductive cells, responsible for creating new daughter colonies. Here, we see a clear division of labor. Some cells are specialized for movement and sensing the environment, others for reproduction. The sphere acts as a single, integrated individual, even though it is made of many cells that are genetically very similar. If you were to break a volvox sphere apart, the individual cells likely wouldn't survive on their own for long. They have become dependent on the cooperative structure. They have crossed a threshold from a loose association to a simple but definite multicellular organism. This transition wasn't sharp or sudden. For a very long time, there existed a whole spectrum of possibilities, simple clumps that easily broke apart, filaments where cells might differ slightly from end to end, sheets where inner and outer cells had subtly different roles, and spheres like volvox, showing a more defined structure and division of labor. It was a period of experimentation, of life exploring the potential of togetherness. The key step was the shift from temporary, accidental clumping to more permanent associations where cells began to rely on each other, where the group itself became the unit of survival and reproduction. The communication between these cells was rudimentary, likely involving simple chemical gradients or direct contact between cell membranes. A cell releasing a certain molecule might signal food nearby to its neighbors, or a change in light intensity detected by outer cells might trigger a coordinated response in their flagella. These were the first, faint conversations between cells, the beginnings of the complex signaling networks that would later orchestrate the development and function of much larger organisms. Think of the profound shift this represented. For billions of years, the essence of life had been the single cell, self-reliant, self-contained. Now, cells were beginning to surrender some of their autonomy, to specialize, to become part of something larger than themselves. It required a new kind of genetic programming, not just for the cell's internal functions, but for interacting with neighbors, for adhering, for signaling, for differentiating into slightly different roles. These changes accumulated slowly, incrementally, favored by natural selection whenever cooperation offered an advantage, however small. It was like learning a new language, the language of teamwork. At first, just a few simple phrases, basic understandings. Stick together, move towards the light, share the food. But these simple beginnings held immense potential. By working together, these cellular teams could achieve things impossible for any single cell alone. They could become larger, escaping predation and exploring new environments. They could create stable internal environments, buffered from the fluctuations outside. They could anchor themselves more effectively, exploit resources more efficiently, and coordinate their behavior in rudimentary yet effective ways. This quiet revolution, this gentle act of cells holding hands and refusing to let go, unfolded in the ancient waters over countless millennia. It wasn't dramatic in the way a volcanic eruption is dramatic, but rather like the slow, inexorable growth of a coral reef built by tiny organisms working together over vast stretches of time. Each small colony, each filament, each sphere was an experiment, a step along a new path. Many of these experiments undoubtedly failed, fading back into the anonymity of single-celled existence. But some persisted. Some found that togetherness worked. The intricate eukaryotic cell, with its nucleus, mitochondria, and other organelles, had provided the necessary internal complexity, the potential for sophisticated behavior. Now, by linking together, these capable cells were unlocking a new level of organization. They were laying the foundation for tissues, for organs, for the complex bodies of fungi, plants, and animals. The lonely journey of the single cell was beginning to transform into the collaborative venture of multicellular life. The stage, once set with complex individual actors, was now witnessing the formation of the first simple troops, learning to perform together in the grand, unfolding story of life. The quiet hum within the cell was now joined by the faintest whisper between cells, a promise of the extraordinary complexity yet to come. And so, in the vast, quiet nurseries of the Precambrian oceans, that faint whisper between cells began to weave itself into something more tangible, something with a gentle shape and a subtle rhythm. The collaborative venture took its first, hesitant steps towards animal life. Imagine drifting down, through layers of cool, dimly lit water, far below any crashing waves, into a realm of profound stillness. The sunlight, if it reached here at all, was filtered to a pale, ethereal glow, illuminating a world primarily painted in shades of blue, gray, and the deep green-brown of microbial mats coating the seafloor. For immense stretches of time, this had been a world dominated by the unseen, the microscopic wanderers, and the patient, mat-building communities. But now, something new was stirring. Shapes that held together, forms that persisted beyond the lifespan of a single cell. Here, anchored lightly to a patch of seabed that wasn't quite rock and wasn't quite slime, you might find one of the earliest experiments in animal form, something akin to a sponge. It wouldn't look like the bath sponges we know, perhaps softer, more irregular, a living structure that seemed almost accidental. Picture a small vase, or maybe a lumpy crust, perforated with countless tiny openings, like living lace. It sat in the quiet current, a passive participant in the ocean's slow dance. There was no head, no tail, no front or back in the way we understand it. It simply was, a collection of cooperating cells, finding advantage in staying together. Inside this simple structure, a quiet miracle was constantly unfolding. Specialized cells, flagellated like their single-celled ancestors, beat rhythmically, creating a gentle but persistent current. Water, carrying microscopic particles of food, stray bacteria, fragments of organic matter, was drawn in through those myriad tiny pores. It flowed through intricate internal canals, a hidden labyrinth within the sponge's body. Other specialized cells, amoeba-like wanderers within the gelatinous matrix between the outer and inner cell layers, captured these minuscule morsels. They shared the gathered nutrients, passing sustenance from cell to cell through intimate contact, a continuation of that first intercellular whisper. Filtered water, relieved of its edible treasures, then flowed out through one or more larger openings, a gentle exhalation back into the silent deep. This was feeding reduced to its absolute essence, drawing the world in, taking a tiny share, and letting the rest pass by. There was no chase, no struggle, just a patient, continuous sifting of the water, hour after hour, day after day, millennium after millennium. These early sponges were living filters, breathing the ocean, sustaining their simple community through collective effort. Some developed tiny, intricate skeletal structures, spicules made of silica, like microscopic glass needles, or of calcium carbonate, or flexible protein fibers like spongin. These provided a delicate internal scaffolding, helping the colony maintain its shape against the gentle pressure of the water, preventing the living vase from collapsing in on itself. They were the first hints of internal skeletons, simple frameworks upon which more complex bodies might eventually be built. Yet, they remained profoundly simple. If you were to gently separate the cells of a sponge, under the right conditions, they could often find each other again, crawling back together, reforming their cooperative structure. They existed on the very edge of individuality, a testament to the power and persistence of cellular cooperation. Elsewhere in these ancient seas, another kind of gentle presence began to make itself known. Drifting in the water column, or perhaps attached to the seafloor like soft, fleshy flowers, were creatures with a different kind of organization. These were the ancestors of jellyfish, sea anemones, and corals, the cnidarians. Unlike the somewhat irregular sponges, these new forms often possessed a simple symmetry, usually radial, like the spokes of a wheel or the petals of a daisy. Imagine a small translucent bell pulsing softly in the dim light, trailing delicate tentacles behind it. This was perhaps one of the first free-drifting animals, a medusa form. Its movement was a simple, rhythmic contraction, pushing water out from beneath its bell, propelling it gently upwards or forwards in the water column. It was not purposeful swimming towards a specific goal, but rather a way to stay afloat, to move passively with the currents, encountering new patches of water that might hold food. The body of this drifting bell was incredibly simple, composed primarily of two layers of cells separated by a jelly-like substance, the mesoglia, which gave it its characteristic texture. An outer layer provided protection and sensation, while an inner layer lined a simple gut cavity, open to the outside world through a single opening that served as both mouth and anus. Food particles, perhaps tiny planktonic organisms bumping against the tentacles, would be captured and drawn into this central cavity for digestion. And the tentacles held a secret weapon, a remarkable cellular innovation, the nematocyst, or stinging cell. Each specialized cell contained a tiny, coiled, harpoon-like thread held under pressure. When triggered by touch, or a chemical cue from potential prey, the cell would explosively discharge this thread, which could pierce, entangle, or inject a minute dose of toxin into the unfortunate microscopic organism that had brushed against it. It was a simple yet highly effective mechanism for capturing food in the vast emptiness of the water column, a passive defense and an opportunistic offense rolled into one. These tiny stinging barbs represented a significant step, cells specializing not just for structure or feeding, but for active interaction with other organisms. Not all early cnidarians were drifters. Some adopted a different strategy, settling onto the sea floor. Picture a small, stalk-like body rooted to the substrate, crowned with a ring of delicate tentacles surrounding a central mouth. This was the polyp form, resembling a tiny sea anemone. It waited patiently, tentacles waving gently in the current, for microscopic prey to drift within reach. Like the medusa, it possessed the same two cell layers, the same simple gut, the same stinging cells. It was simply a different expression of the same basic body plan, anchored instead of free-floating. Some of these early polyps might have lived solitary lives, while others could have budded, creating small colonies, the beginnings of the great reef-building enterprises that corals would undertake much later in Earth's history. These creatures, the pulsing medusae and the rooted polyps, represented another leap in complexity. They had distinct tissues, groups of similar cells working together to perform a specific function, like the outer protective layer or the inner digestive layer. They possessed rudimentary muscle cells, allowing for the coordinated contractions that produced movement or drew tentacles towards the mouth. And, perhaps most significantly, they had the beginnings of a nervous system, a simple network of nerve cells, a nerve net, spread throughout the body. There was no central brain, no command center, just a diffuse web that could transmit signals, allowing the organism to react to stimuli in a coordinated way. A touch on one side could trigger a contraction of the whole bell, or cause tentacles to withdraw. It was the simplest form of awareness, a basic connection between sensation and response, the first faint glimmerings of the complex nervous systems that would eventually allow animals to perceive and navigate their world in intricate detail. These early animals, the sponges and the cnidarian-like forms, were revolutionary, yet they inhabited their world with a profound quietness. They were wiggles and squiggles in an ocean, still largely defined by microscopic life and slow geological processes. They possessed no eyes to witness the dim light, no ears to hear the silence, no complex brains to contemplate their existence. Their world was one of immediate sensation, the texture of the seafloor beneath them, the gentle push of water currents, the chemical taste of the water bringing hints of food or danger, the brief contact with a drifting particle. They reacted, they fed, they reproduced, likely through simple budding or the release of eggs and sperm into the water, entrusting the future of their kind to the currents. The seafloor itself was different then. Large stretches were covered in thick, rubbery microbial mats, built up over millennia by cyanobacteria and other microbes. These mats formed a living skin over the sediment, influencing the chemistry of the water above. The earliest animals often lived on or near these mats, perhaps grazing on them, or finding anchorage. Imagine simple, flattened shapes, like quilted leaves or segmented ribbons, lying upon these microbial carpets. Fossils from the Ediacaran period hint at such forms. Strange experiments in multicellular living that don't fit neatly into modern animal groups. Were they animals, fungi, or something else entirely? Their exact nature remains a gentle mystery, whispers from a time before the familiar body plans solidified. They represent the incredible creativity of early life, exploring different ways to be multicellular, different shapes to inhabit, before the patterns we recognize today became dominant. Think of this time as a slow, silent blossoming in the deep. Life, having mastered the intricacies of the eukaryotic cell and the initial challenge of holding cells together, was now exploring the possibilities of form and function. Sponges perfected the art of passive filtering, building simple bodies from cooperative cells. Cnidarians developed basic tissues, simple movement, and the first nerve nets, allowing for a more active, albeit still very simple, interaction with their surroundings. Other enigmatic forms experimented with flattened bodies, perhaps absorbing nutrients directly through their surfaces from the rich microbial mats below. Each wiggle, each squiggle, each gentle pulse or patient filtering was a testament to the unfolding potential held within those first cooperating cells. They were the pioneers, the first quiet actors taking their places on the multicellular stage. They were not dramatic conquerors, but rather gentle emergences, adding subtle new textures and movements to the ancient, silent seascape. The profound quiet of the deep ocean now held not just the hum of single cells and the rustle of microbial mats, but also the soft draw and release of water through a sponge, the faint bell-like pulse of a drifting jelly, the slow wave of a polyp's tentacle. The whisper between cells had found its first simple voices, singing a quiet, foundational song in the grand, unfolding story of life. The stage was set, the first animal actors were present, and the next acts, filled with increasing complexity and diversification, were patiently waiting in the wings of time. The quiet song of the early animals continued its gentle refrain in the vast, dimly lit oceans. The soft draw and release of water through sponges, the almost imperceptible pulse of drifting jellies, the slow, searching wave of a polyp's tentacle. These were the subtle melodies played out against the ancient hum of single cells and the rustle of microbial mats. Time flowed like a deep, slow current, carrying these first simple multicellular tunes through epochs we can barely comprehend. The stage, though set, remained bathed in a soft, unchanging twilight, awaiting a cue that seemed as though it might never arrive. But then, almost imperceptibly at first, a change began to ripple through the stillness. It wasn't a sudden crash or a dramatic upheaval, but more like the way the air changes before a gentle spring rain, a subtle shift in pressure, a new scent carried on the breeze. Or perhaps, more fittingly for this underwater realm, it was like the slow dawning of a new kind of light, filtering down from unimaginable distances, reaching depths that had known only the faintest glimmers before. This new potential didn't arrive with a fanfare. It seeped into the world, awakening possibilities that had lain dormant within the very fabric of life. Imagine the seabed, that ancient landscape of microbial carpets, occasionally dotted with the simple forms of sponges and jellies, beginning to transform. Think of it not as a stage anymore, but as a vast, submerged garden plot, patiently tilled by time and circumstance. The microbial mats with a rich soil, teeming with unseen life and nutrients. The early animals, the sponges and their kin, were like the first hardy mosses, or simple ground cover, establishing the very possibility of multicellular growth. For aeons, this garden had slumbered, holding its potential deep within. And then, the blooming began. Not all at once in a chaotic burst, but with a gathering momentum, like watching a time-lapse film of a garden waking after a long winter. Seeds of complexity, sown long ago in the genetic code, began to sprout. New shapes, new forms, new ways of being started to emerge from the quiet sediment, adding textures and structures the world had never witnessed before. Picture, if you can, small creatures beginning to move with a newfound deliberateness across the ocean floor. Some looked like tiny, segmented ribbons, their bodies repeating patterns like beads strung together. From these segments sprouted delicate, jointed limbs, legs that could step and probe and scuttle with a precision quite unlike the slow ooze or gentle drift that had defined animal movement until now. Imagine them, miniatures of intricacy, tracing paths through the soft mud, their tiny legs carrying them purposefully through the quiet water. Some developed coverings, like flexible coats of mail, sectioned plates that offered a measure of protection, a firmness against the gentle press of the water, or the accidental bump of a neighbor. They explored their world with delicate feelers, antennae that swept gently through the water, tasting, touching, sensing the subtle chemical whispers of their surroundings. These were the first walkers, the first crawlers, bringing a new kind of directed movement to the ancient seabed garden. Elsewhere, other forms began to experiment with different kinds of protection, different kinds of beauty. Imagine spirals appearing, delicate whorls of mineralized tissue drawn out into elegant cones or tightly coiled like miniature ammonites, though these were their much, much earlier cousins. These were the first shells, secreted patiently, layer by layer, by the soft bodies held within. Slow, muscular feet, like hidden tongues of flesh, might glide over the microbial mats, carrying these precious, self-made homes. Think of the light, faint as it was, catching the pearly luster of these nascent shells. Other creatures fashioned hinged coverings, two halves like tiny, sturdy lockets or treasure boxes, nestled in the sediment. Imagine them lying slightly open, filtering the water for sustenance, then snapping shut with a soft, decisive click if disturbed by a shadow or a current. These were the sea's first jewelry boxes, cradling the soft vulnerability of life within hard, beautiful cases, adding points of reflected light and solid geometry to the garden floor. And the variety was astonishing. It wasn't just one or two new kinds of shapes, but a whole meadow's worth, blooming in relative geological quick succession. Imagine creatures resembling soft, velvety worms, perhaps burrowing into the sediment, creating hidden pathways beneath the surface, aerating the soil of this underwater garden. Picture others that floated gently, not like the simple bells of the earlier jellies, but with more complex, undulating fins, or perhaps trailing delicate, feathery appendages to capture passing morsels. Some forms seemed almost fantastical, experiments in biological artistry. Imagine creatures like walking stems, adorned with rows of waving spines along their backs, moving with an improbable, delicate grace on stilt-like legs. Picture beings with bodies that seemed assembled from disparate parts, perhaps 5 eyes on short stalks peering curiously from a flattened body, or a strange nozzle-like mouth probing the sediment. These were not mistakes, but bold explorations of what was possible, like strange and wonderful flowers appearing in the garden, defying simple classification, showcasing the sheer, untamed inventiveness that life was capable of. They remind us that evolution doesn't always follow straight lines. Sometimes it meanders, experiments, and creates forms of breathtaking, alien beauty. This ancient garden was filled not just with the familiar precursors of forms we know today, but with unique wonders that existed only for a time, adding their own fleeting, extraordinary colors and shapes to the grand display. What prompted this incredible flourishing, this sudden riot of form and structure in the quiet depths? The reasons are likely as complex and interwoven as the ecosystem that was emerging. Perhaps the very water itself was changing, becoming richer in dissolved oxygen, the vital breath needed to power more active bodies and build larger, more complex structures. It was like a gentle, enriching rain falling upon the garden, providing the resources needed for more elaborate growth. Perhaps, too, the genetic language of life itself had recently acquired a richer vocabulary. Imagine the discovery of new grammatical rules, new sets of instructions, genes, like the famous Hox genes, that allowed for the development of distinct body regions, specialized limbs, segmented bodies, and heads with concentrated senses. It was as if the blueprints for building life had suddenly gained chapters on architecture, allowing for the construction of intricate, three-dimensional forms where only simple sketches had been possible before. These new genetic tools didn't invent the shapes out of nothing, but they provided the means to organize cells and tissues in much more complex and varied ways, unlocking the potential for the diverse body plans that blossomed across the seabed. And perhaps the most profound change was the dawn of true perception. Imagine the evolution of the first eyes, not just simple light-sensitive spots, but structures capable of forming images, however rudimentary. Suddenly, the dim underwater world was no longer just a realm of touch and chemical gradients. It became a world of shapes, of movements, of shadows. Creatures could see each other. This changed everything. It introduced a new dynamic, a new layer of interaction. Seeing allowed for active hunting, for deliberate pursuit, and it allowed for active evasion, for the recognition of danger. This might have been the gentle pressure that encouraged the development of protective shells and harder coverings. It might have spurred the evolution of camouflage, of new ways to blend in with the increasingly complex background of the seabed garden. It might have driven the need for faster movement, for more agile swimming or scuttling. The simple act of seeing introduced the intricate dance of predator and prey, a dance that would shape the evolution of life profoundly from that point forward. It wasn't necessarily a violent struggle, especially not at first, but a subtle, pervasive pressure, like plants in a garden competing for sunlight, driving adaptations, encouraging diversity. The appearance of shells might be likened to thorns on a rose, the development of camouflage like the dappled patterns on a forest floor plant, all responses to the new reality of being seen. So, this period, often called the Cambrian explosion, wasn't an explosion in the sense of violence or chaos. It was more like the astonishingly rapid blooming of a diverse garden, where countless new flowers and plants appear in a relatively short span of time, transforming a sparse landscape into a vibrant tapestry of life. The seabed, once a quiet expanse of microbial mats and simple filterers, became a bustling, three-dimensional world populated by creatures that crawled, swam, burrowed, hunted, hid, and adorned themselves with shells and spines. Each new form was a testament to the inherent creativity of life, building upon the foundations laid down over billions of years. The complex eukaryotic cell, the cooperation of multicellularity, the development of basic tissues, all these earlier innovations were the necessary groundwork for this incredible proliferation of shapes. The garden didn't replace the soil or the mosses, it grew from them, incorporating them into a richer, more complex ecosystem. The silence of the deep was now filled with a multitude of tiny movements: the scuttling of jointed legs on sediment, the snap of a closing shell, the swish of a primitive tail fin propelling a body through the water, the probing touch of antennae. The faint light filtering down from above now glinted off myriad surfaces, the pearly sheen of a spiral shell, the segmented armor of an arthropod ancestor, perhaps even the lens of a nascent eye. The world had gained texture, complexity, and a whole new dimension of interaction. It was a world brimming with novelty, a living laboratory where evolution experimented with countless designs. Many of these experiments would eventually fade, like beautiful flowers that bloom for only one season, leaving behind fossilized hints of their strange beauty in ancient rocks. Others would prove incredibly successful, founding lineages that continue to this day, their basic body plans still recognizable in the crabs, snails, starfish, and even the distant ancestors of vertebrates that swim in our modern oceans. This burgeoning garden of the Cambrian seas was a pivotal moment in the grand story of life. It marked the point where the animal kingdom truly came into its own, diversifying into the fundamental array of body plans that would shape the future of complex life on Earth. The quiet, foundational song sung by the first simple animals had swelled into a complex, multi-part harmony, a chorus of myriad forms exploring the possibilities of existence in the ancient ocean. The world was becoming wonderfully, astonishingly full, a place of intricate shapes and hidden wonders, still unfolding its mysteries in the patient, deep currents of time. While the ancient oceans shimmered and pulsed with this newfound complexity, with creatures testing out shells and legs and complex eyes in the sun-dappled waters, the lands lay waiting. Imagine vast continents, utterly silent save for the sigh of the wind across bare rock and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. No birdsong, no rustle of leaves, no hum of insects, for none of these yet existed. The land was a stark canvas of stone and dust, baked by a sun unfiltered by the gentle green shade we know today. It stretched out, immense and empty, washed by rains that ran off quickly, carving channels in the naked earth, carrying sediments down to the sea where life was already so busy. The air itself was different, thinner perhaps, harsher. For an organism used to the constant embrace of water, the land was an alien desert, a place of dangerous dryness and unrelenting gravity. Yet, even in this seemingly inhospitable world, life's quiet insistence was beginning to stir at the edges. Not with the sudden burst of forms seen in the Cambrian seas, but with a slow, tentative creeping. Close to the water's edge, perhaps in shallow freshwater pools that warmed in the sun, or along coastlines where tides rhythmically soaked and exposed the shore, lived simple green organisms. These were likely kinds of algae, relatives of the seaweeds thriving offshore, content for ages in their watery home. They were simple, needing little more than sunlight, water, and the dissolved nutrients bathing their cells. But the boundary between water and land is not always sharp. Sometimes the pools dried a little between rains. Sometimes the tides receded further, leaving damp films on the rocks. In these liminal spaces, these thresholds between two worlds, the first whispers of a terrestrial future began. Imagine these humble pioneers. Perhaps they were thin, green films, clinging low to the damp surfaces, resembling the algae you might see today on a wet stone by a stream. They had no roots, no stems, no leaves as we know them. Their lives were still intimately tied to the presence of water. When submerged, they could absorb all they needed directly through their simple bodies. But when the water drew back, leaving them exposed to the air and the sun, they faced a profound crisis. Water, the very essence of their being, would evaporate from their surfaces, leaving them dry, brittle, potentially lifeless. The sunlight, their source of energy, was also a danger, its unfiltered ultraviolet rays capable of damaging their delicate cells. And without the buoyant support of water, how could they even hold themselves up against the pull of gravity? The land was a realm of harsh challenges, demanding radical new ways of being. Evolution, however, works with patient, tireless ingenuity. It doesn't make grand leaps overnight, but rather favors small, incremental changes, tiny advantages that accumulate over immense stretches of time. Perhaps some of these early green pioneers possessed, purely by chance, a slightly thicker outer layer than their neighbors. This minuscule difference might have allowed them to retain moisture just a little bit longer when the water receded. In the relentless cycle of wetting and drying, this tiny advantage meant survival. These slightly more resilient individuals were more likely to endure the dry spells, more likely to pass on their traits to the next generation. Slowly, over countless generations, this trait was refined. A thin, waxy coating began to develop on the outer surfaces of these plants, a cuticle. Think of it as a microscopic, transparent raincoat, sealing the plant's precious moisture inside, protecting it from the drying air. It was one of the first crucial adaptations, a shield against the land's harsh thirst. But this raincoat posed a new problem. Plants, like animals, need to breathe. They take in carbon dioxide from the air to use in photosynthesis, and they release oxygen and water vapor. How could they exchange these gases if they were sealed inside a waterproof coating? The answer came in the form of tiny, specialized pores, like microscopic mouths scattered across the plant's surface, stomata. These ingenious little openings could open to allow gas exchange when conditions were favorable, perhaps when the air was humid or during cooler parts of the day, and then close tightly when the air became dry, conserving water. They were like little gatekeepers, carefully balancing the need to breathe with the need to stay hydrated. Watching over the plant's internal water balance, they allowed life to persist within the protective cuticle. Another challenge was support. In water, organisms are gently held, buoyed up. On land, gravity is a constant downward pull. The earliest land dwellers were likely flat, sprawling mats, hugging the ground for support and moisture. But to reach for the sunlight more effectively, to rise even slightly above their neighbors, required internal strength. Within their cells, new materials began to be incorporated into the cell walls, substances that were rigid and strong, like tiny reinforcing beams. These strengthened cells could stack upon each other, providing a simple form of structural support, allowing the plant to lift itself, however slightly, away from the immediate surface of the rock or soil. Later, specialized tissues would evolve, vascular tissues, like bundles of tiny pipes. Some of these pipes, the xylem, were made of incredibly strong, dead cells whose walls provided excellent support, acting like an internal skeleton. These same pipes also served another vital function, transporting water. Because now, living on land meant water wasn't all around anymore. It was primarily down, hidden within the soil or rock crevices. The simple absorption through the entire surface that worked in the water was no longer sufficient. These pioneering plants needed a way to anchor themselves and, more importantly, to draw water up from below. Delicate, hair-like filaments began to explore the substrate beneath them, rhizoids. These weren't true roots yet, more like simple anchors that could also absorb some moisture and dissolve nutrients from the thin layer of damp soil or the surface of the rock they clung to. They were the first tentative connections to the earth itself, tendrils reaching down to sip the hidden water, holding the plant steady against the wind and rain. As plants grew more complex, these would evolve into true root systems, delving deeper, branching wider, forming an intricate network to mine the earth for water and minerals. And finally, there was the challenge of reproduction. In the water, many algae release sperm cells that swim freely to find egg cells. This requires liquid water. On land, such a strategy is unreliable. How could new life begin if the vital meeting of reproductive cells depended on a puddle or a film of dew? The solution was marvelously resilient: the spore. Spores are tiny, single-celled reproductive units, encased in a tough, protective wall. This wall made them incredibly resistant to drying out and other environmental stresses. They were lightweight, easily carried by the wind over vast distances. When a spore landed in a suitably damp and welcoming spot, it could germinate, growing into a new plant. This freed reproduction, at least partly, from the need for standing water, allowing plants to spread further inland, carried on the breeze like microscopic seeds of green hope. So began the slow greening of the continents. It wasn't a sudden invasion, but a patient, quiet advance, unfolding over millions upon millions of years. Imagine the first patches of velvety green appearing on the damp rocks near waterfalls, or spreading like a soft stain along the banks of primordial rivers. These weren't towering forests, they were humble carpets, perhaps resembling the mosses and liverworts we see today, simple, low-growing, still needing moist environments. But definitively, land, plants. They formed thin, living skins over the sterile ground. Where they grew, they subtly changed the world around them. Their rhizoids probed the rock, contributing to its slow breakdown. When they died, their bodies decomposed, mixing with rock particles to create the very first hints of soil, a richer, more welcoming medium for future generations. They breathed, taking in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen, slowly altering the composition of the atmosphere itself. This gradual spreading was like a slow tide of green washing over the barren lands. It crept up river valleys, colonized the edges of lakes, found refuge in damp hollows. Picture the world transforming, century by century, millennium by millennium. The stark grey and brown landscapes began to soften, blushed with shades of green. The silence began to be filled, not yet with animal sounds, but with the almost imperceptible whisper of life taking hold, the quiet sigh of photosynthesis, the gentle resilience of growth. These first green blankets were thin, easily torn, vulnerable still to drought and harsh conditions, but they were a beginning. They were the brave pioneers, the first organisms to truly conquer the challenges of terrestrial life, paving the way for all the complex plant life that would follow, the ferns, the conifers, the flowering plants that now clothe our world in such vibrant diversity. They laid down the living foundation, the soft green carpet upon which the next acts of life's grand story on land could begin to unfold. It was a quiet revolution, painted in shades of green, a testament to life's enduring power to adapt, to explore, and to transform the very face of the planet, breathing a gentle, living color into the silent, waiting lands. And so, the green invitation lay spread across the damp edges of the world. That soft, living carpet, woven thread by the patient plants, held a quiet promise. It was a place transformed, no longer just bare rock and sterile grit, but a realm breathing a different kind of air, holding moisture in its nascent soils, offering sustenance in the form of the plants themselves, and perhaps shelter beneath their low fronds. The water, teeming with life for so long, now had a neighbor, a strange, still frontier washed in shades of green. And life, ever curious, ever pushing at boundaries, began to notice. Not with thought, not with intention as we know it, but with the slow, unconscious drift of existence seeking opportunity. Imagine, now, the very edge of a primordial pool where the green mosses met the waterlogged earth. Here, tiny movements began to stir, not just in the water, but beside it. Small creatures, already ancient in their lineage, dwellers of the shallows and the submerged world, found themselves at this new threshold. These were the arthropods, creatures encased in sturdy, jointed armor, with legs already well practiced in navigating complex underwater terrains. Perhaps they resembled tiny millipedes, their many legs carrying them like ripples over the damp surfaces, or small wingless insects akin to springtails, testing the ground with delicate antennae. Maybe early scorpion-like arachnids, predators of the shallow water margins, cautiously extended their reach onto the land. They were, in their own way, pre-adapted. Their external skeletons, which protected them in the water, offered crucial support against the unfamiliar pull of gravity in the air. Their jointed limbs could already manage locomotion on a solid surface. Yet, the challenges were immense. The air, thin and dry compared to the embracing water, threatened to steal their vital moisture. Breathing, once a simple matter of filtering water through gills, now required new strategies, perhaps simple pores or tubes opening to the outside, sipping the air in tiny, cautious gasps. Picture them, these miniature pioneers, venturing out perhaps only a few centimeters at first. See them scuttling from the safety of the water's edge into the damp shade beneath a patch of primitive liverworts. Imagine their delicate legs tracing patterns on mud that had never before felt such a touch. They would have stayed close to the life-giving wetness, exploring the humid microclimates held within the green carpets. Their world was one of glistening water droplets clinging to moss, the earthy smell of the first soils, the cool undersides of damp stones. They might have fed on the decaying plant matter, becoming the first recyclers in this new terrestrial system, or perhaps nibbled on the living plants themselves. Some, inevitably, would have preyed upon each other, bringing the ancient dance of hunter and hunted onto the land in miniature form. These were not bold conquerors striding into the unknown. They were tentative explorers, drawn by the lure of untapped resources, perhaps pushed by competition or predation, in the crowded waters they left behind. Their excursions onto land might have been fleeting initially, brief forays into the air, before retreating to the familiar comfort of the water. But over countless generations, those individuals better equipped to withstand the dryness, to breathe the air, to find food on land, would have thrived. Slowly, hesitantly, they established a foothold. The silence of the green lands began to be filled with the faintest of sounds, the almost imperceptible rustle of tiny bodies moving through the low vegetation, the whisper of miniature legs on damp earth. They were the first animals to truly breathe the air and walk the land, tiny adventurers claiming the world centimeter by centimeter. While these small invertebrates were making their quiet inroads, another story was unfolding back in the water, particularly in the shallows near the newly greened shores. Here lived fish, but not quite like the darting, silvery swimmers we might first imagine. Among them were the lobe-finned fishes, creatures possessing something remarkable, fins that were not just delicate, webbed rays, but muscular, fleshy lobes supported by sturdy internal bones. These fins were powerful, capable of propelling them through thick underwater vegetation or even propping their bodies up on the muddy bottoms of shallow pools. These shallow water environments, often choked with plant life and debris, could sometimes be poor in dissolved oxygen. And so, another crucial adaptation began to appear in some of these fish. Outpouchings of their throats, simple sacs that could gulp air from the surface. These were the precursors to lungs. Imagine such a fish, resting in the warm, murky shallows. When the water grew stale, it could rise to the surface, break through the tension film with its snout, and take a breath of the air above, supplementing the oxygen it gleaned through its gills. Strong fins for navigating cluttered shallows, and primitive lungs for breathing air, these traits evolved, in the water, solutions to aquatic problems. Yet, they held the key to an entirely different realm. What gentle pressures might have nudged these fish towards the shore? Perhaps the shallows offered refuge from larger aquatic predators lurking in deeper waters. Perhaps the increasing abundance of those little arthropods scuttling near the water's edge presented a tempting new source of food, easily snatched with a quick lunge onto the bank. Or maybe, during seasonal dry spells, the pools they inhabited shrank, forcing them to make short, desperate journeys overland, heaving themselves through the mud from one dwindling puddle to the next. Those with stronger, more supportive fins and more efficient air-breathing abilities would have been more likely to survive such trials, to reach the next pool, to pass on their advantageous traits. Picture then the next extraordinary step. A fish-like creature, perhaps resembling a modern lungfish or an ancient relative like Tiktaalik, pushing itself out of the water. Not leaping, not walking, but something in between. Using those strong, fleshy fins like crude limbs, it levers its body forward onto the muddy bank. Its eyes, perhaps raised on top of its head, swivel, taking in the strange, air-filled world. It feels the unaccustomed weight of its own body, no longer supported by the buoyancy of water. It breathes the air, not just as a supplement, but as its primary source of oxygen for these moments out of its element. The damp earth clings to its scales. It might move only a short distance, a body length or two, perhaps to seize a small arthropod, or simply to rest in the moist shade of the low plants before sliding back into the water. These first forays onto land by vertebrates were likely clumsy, brief, and utterly dependent on proximity to water. These creatures were not fish deciding to become land animals. They were fish adapting to the challenges and opportunities of the water's edge, their existing traits coincidentally proving useful for brief excursions ashore. But, over vast stretches of time, measured in millions of years, the process continued. Generation after patient generation, natural selection favored those individuals whose fins were slightly stronger, whose bones were a little sturdier, whose lungs were more efficient, whose skin was perhaps a little better at retaining moisture. Slowly, those muscular lobes at the base of the fins transformed. Bones shifted, strengthened, and rearranged, becoming the fundamental structures of limbs. First stout, paddle-like appendages, and eventually, jointed legs with distinct digits capable of supporting weight and enabling more effective movement on land. The connection between the head and the body loosened, allowing the head to turn independently, a crucial development for scanning the terrestrial environment. The spine grew stronger to bear weight against gravity. Gills, while perhaps still present, became less important for respiration, while lungs became the primary organs for breathing air. Hearing adapted too, changing from detecting vibrations in water to capturing sounds traveling through the thinner medium of air. It was an incremental transformation, an unconscious sculpting by circumstance over eons. Each small change, barely noticeable in a single lifetime, accumulated. The awkward heave became a more supported crawl. The brief foray extended into longer periods spent out of the water. These creatures, the early tetrapods, the four-footed ones, or at least their immediate ancestors, were inching their way into a new existence. The world they entered was still vastly different from our own. Imagine vast stretches of low green carpets, perhaps interspersed with slightly taller, fern-like plants in the dampest areas. The air would have smelled earthy, damp, perhaps with the faint scent of decomposition from the plant matter and the tiny invertebrates. The loudest sounds might have been the wind sighing through the primitive foliage, or the splash of water nearby. But listen closely, and you might hear the subtle scuttling of those first arthropod inhabitants, the new sound of a tetrapod dragging its body over the mud, the gulping intake of air into developing lungs. It was a quiet world, a gentle beginning for animal life on land. No birdsong filled the air, no mammals rustled in the undergrowth. But the foundation was being laid. The plants had prepared the way, creating the stage and dressing the set in green. The small arthropods had ventured out first, tiny scouts exploring the new territory and becoming part of its emerging ecosystem. And now, the vertebrates, carrying their watery heritage within them but reaching tentatively for the air, were taking their first, slow, momentous steps ashore. It wasn't an invasion, but a gradual emigration, a hesitant exploration driven by the timeless rhythms of life, seeking sustenance and safety. These little steps, taken in the mud and moss of ancient shorelines, were the beginning of an incredible journey, the start of a new chapter in the grand, unfolding story of life on Earth. The land, once silent and barren, was slowly, softly, beginning to stir with animal life. The tentative steps onto land, over unimaginable stretches of time, gave way to bolder strides. The small, hesitant explorers clinging to the damp edges of continents were pioneers, and like all pioneers, they paved the way for others, for transformations they could never have foreseen. The world itself was changing, breathing in and out on a geological timescale. Continents drifted, oceans opened and closed, mountains rose and fell, but through long, vast stretches of this unfolding middle age of Earth's life, a particular kind of warmth settled over the planet. Imagine an age bathed in enduring sunlight, a greenhouse world where polar ice caps were distant memories of a colder past, or perhaps hadn't even formed yet in the way we know them. For millions upon millions of years, the Earth experienced a prolonged summer. The air was thicker then, rich with carbon dioxide, trapping the sun's heat close to the surface. Shallow seas spread far inland, creating warm, extensive coastlines and vast inland waterways. There were no glaciers grinding landscapes, no frozen tundra stretching across continents. Instead, picture a world draped in green, from equator almost to the poles. The descendants of those first simple land plants had diversified, grown ambitious, reached for the sky. Vast forests covered the land, but they were forests unlike any we know today. Towering ferns, some growing as large as trees, unfurled their intricate fronds towards the humid air. Cycads, resembling sturdy palm trees with tough, leathery leaves arranged in crowns, stood in dense groves. And conifers, ancestors of our modern pines and firs, pushed skyward, their needles and cones adding different textures and scents to the air, the sharp tang of resin, the deep perfume of evergreen foliage. Ginkgo trees, with their unique fan-shaped leaves, lined the banks of slow-moving rivers. This wasn't the delicate, flowering world we know. There were no blossoms scenting the breeze, no petals unfurling in vibrant colors, no fruit ripening on the branch. It was a world of greens and browns, a more ancient palette, dominated by spores and seeds carried on the wind or water. The sheer abundance of plant life was staggering. Under the consistent warmth and plentiful moisture, vegetation grew thick and fast, creating layers upon layers of green. Fern prairies might have stretched across open areas, while dense jungles of cycads and tree ferns choked the river valleys. Higher ground might have supported immense forests of conifers, their tall trunks like pillars holding up a canopy far above. And in this world of abundant green, life grew large, very large. The small vertebrates that had first crawled ashore continued to adapt, diversify, and grow. Over epochs, some lineages took to this warm, plant-rich world with extraordinary success. They became the giants. This was the time when giants roamed gently upon the earth. Picture them now, moving through these ancient landscapes. The sauropods, creatures of such immense scale they challenge our imagination. Imagine a living mountain range, slowly wading through a forest of tree ferns. Their legs were colossal pillars, thick as ancient tree trunks, supporting bodies the size of several buses. From these immense torsos stretched necks of impossible length, some reaching 50 feet or more, allowing them to browse high in the canopy, like living cranes delicately plucking leaves from the tallest branches. At the other end, equally long tails stretched out behind them, balancing their incredible forms, sometimes held high off the ground, sometimes perhaps sweeping low over the ferns and cycads. Their heads, perched at the end of those extraordinary necks, were often surprisingly small, equipped simply for the task of gathering food. Day in, day out, their lives revolved around consumption. You might hear the steady, rhythmic tearing and grinding of plant matter, a sound amplified by the sheer number of these creatures that often move together. Imagine the sound, not a sharp crackle, but a deep, continuous processing of vegetation, the sound of living engines fueling immense bodies. They moved slowly, deliberately. Each step must have landed with a soft thud, perhaps making the ground tremble ever so slightly if you were nearby. A herd of these giants moving across a floodplain would have been a sight of profound scale and unhurried power. They were like living landscapes themselves, their patterned hides, perhaps dappled green and brown, blending with the forests they moved through and fed upon. Think of them by the water's edge, lowering those long necks to drink from a wide, slow-moving river, reflecting the hazy sky. The water laps gently around their pillar-like legs. Perhaps smaller reptiles scuttle out of their path, ancient crocodiles bask motionless on the muddy banks, and large insects with gauzy wings buzz through the warm, humid air. The dominant sound, apart from their own feeding and movement, might be the drone of insects, the sigh of the wind through the giant leaves, the distant call of another dinosaur echoing through the trees. It was a world filled with life, but perhaps lacking the sharp, high-pitched variety of sounds we know today. The calls might have been deeper, more resonant, bellows, rumbles, hisses. These sauropods, the Brontosaurus, Diplodocus, Brachiosaurus, and their many kin, were the embodiment of this era's scale. They were biological triumphs of engineering, pushing the limits of vertebrate size on land. Their existence was only possible because of the unique conditions, the warm climate, the abundant food source that required little energy to digest compared to its bulk, and perhaps the very air they breathed, richer in oxygen during certain periods, which might have helped fuel such large bodies. They were not alone in their plant-eating habits. Other giants shared these ancient ecosystems. Imagine the Stegosaurus, not as tall as the sauropods, but impressively built, with its rows of bony plates along its back, like great decorative shields, and the formidable spikes on its tail. It likely browsed on lower-growing vegetation, perhaps ferns and cycads, its small head close to the ground. Picture the iguanodon and its relatives, dinosaurs capable of walking on 2 legs or 4, with sturdy bodies and strong jaws for chewing tougher plants, sometimes possessing thumb spikes, perhaps used for defense or manipulating branches. There was a whole spectrum of herbivores, large and small, adapting to feed on different parts of the abundant plant life, from the lowest shrubs to the highest canopy. For us, looking back across the abyss of time, this era, the Mesozoic, often conjures images of fearsome predators, the Tyrannosaurus rex, the Allosaurus. And indeed, large carnivores did stalk these ancient lands. They were part of the ecosystem, shaping the evolution of the herbivores through predation, driving adaptations like size, armor, or herd behavior. But perhaps our focus on the dramatic hunt overshadows the long, quiet reality for much of this time. For vast stretches of the millions of years that dinosaurs ruled the Earth, the overwhelming biomass, the sheer weight of animal life, belonged to the plant-eaters. The world was primarily shaped, grazed, and moved through by these colossal, peaceful browsers. Imagine the sheer duration of this reality. Not thousands of years, not even a million, but tens of millions, over 100 million years where these types of creatures were the dominant large animals on land. Generation after generation of sauropods hatched from eggs grew to immense size under the warm sun, joined herds, browsed the endless forests, drank from wide rivers, and eventually died, their colossal bones sometimes sinking into the mud to become the fossils that whisper their stories to us today. It was a dynasty of giants, ruling not through aggression, but through sheer presence and adaptation to a world perfectly suited for them. Feel the warmth of that ancient air on your skin, thick with humidity and the scent of damp earth, resinous conifers, and decaying vegetation. See the sunlight filtering down through the canopy of giant ferns and cycads, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. Hear the low buzz of oversized insects, the distant, resonant call of an unseen creature, the soft, earth-shaking tread of a sauropod herd moving through the trees in the distance. It's a world humming with life, but a life lived at a different pace, on a different scale. A world of greens and browns, of slow rhythms, of immense quiet power embodied in the gentle giants browsing the endless forests. This long age of warmth and giants wasn't static, of course. Even within this era, climates fluctuated, sea levels rose and fell, plant life evolved. The first flowering plants would eventually make their quiet debut towards the end of this age, a hint of changes to come. New types of dinosaurs evolved, others faded away. The continents continued their slow, inexorable drift, rearranging the map of the world. But the overarching theme, the dominant chord resonating through these 100 million years and more, was one of stability, warmth, and the reign of the great herbivores. They were the heart of the ecosystem, the gentle giants moving through a world that seemed made for them, a long, green, warm afternoon in the history of life on Earth. Their time seems impossibly distant, their forms fantastical, yet they were real, a testament to life's ability to reach incredible sizes and forms when the conditions are right. They were a slow, majestic chapter in the grand story, a time when the Earth truly belonged to the giants, who, for the most part, roamed it gently. And so, that long, warm afternoon of the Earth stretched on, measured not in hours or days, but in epochs, in the slow turning of continents and the even slower evolution of life. The air remained thick and humid, the forests vast and green, dominated by the quiet majesty of the giant herbivores. Their slow heartbeats seemed to set the rhythm for the entire planet, a steady, ancient pulse beneath the sun. It felt, perhaps, as though it might last forever, this gentle kingdom of giants, this world bathed in perpetual warmth. Change happened, yes, but slowly, like the imperceptible creep of a vine, or the gradual shifting of a river's course over millennia. The world breathed deeply, contentedly, in the age of the great dinosaurs. But the story of life is a story of cycles, of seasons writ large across the face of time. Even the longest summer must eventually yield. Unseen, unfelt by the creatures browsing the fern prairies or nesting in the cycad groves, deeper changes were stirring. Far below the surface, the great tectonic plates continued their relentless, slow-motion ballet, reshaping oceans and pushing up mountains, altering currents of air and water in ways that would subtly begin to test the edges of that long stability. And in the plant kingdom, those small, almost unnoticed flowering plants were diversifying, spreading quietly, bringing new colors, new scents, new kinds of nourishment into the world, weaving a new thread into the ancient tapestry. These were subtle shifts, whispers of change against the deep, resonant chord of the dinosaurs' reign. Then, the rhythm broke, not with a slow fading, but with a sudden, profound alteration. Imagine looking up at the familiar sky, the pale blue canvas arching over the green world, and seeing something impossible. A light brighter than the sun, for just a moment, searing itself onto the world's memory, followed not by thunder, but by a deeper tremor, a shudder running through the very bones of the earth. And then, a change in the light itself. A veil began to be drawn across the sun, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. Dust and vapor, thrown high into the atmosphere from a colossal disturbance far away, perhaps an impact from the vast, dark ocean of space beyond Earth, began to shroud the planet. The warmth, that constant, life-giving warmth, began to leach away. The air grew cooler, day by day. The sunlight, when it filtered through the high haze, was thin and pale, lacking its former strength. It was as if a sudden, unexpected winter had descended upon the world, catching the long summer completely by surprise. The sky, once blue or grey with rain clouds, might have taken on strange hues, tinged with the dust of pulverized rock and the smoke from vast wildfires ignited by the initial event's fierce heat. A fine layer of pale dust, alien to the lush green world, began to settle everywhere, blanketing leaves, dusting the backs of the great creatures, falling softly into the waters. The world grew quieter. The vibrant hum of the oversized insects perhaps lessened. The air, cooler now, carried sounds differently. But the most profound silence came from the absence of the giants. The earth no longer trembled softly with the tread of sauropod herds. The deep, resonant calls echoing through the forests faded. The world that had been made for them, that had suited their immense size and slow metabolisms so perfectly, had changed in a geological heartbeat. Those magnificent creatures, the dinosaurs, who had dominated the planet for so long, were exquisitely adapted to the world that was. Their very size, a testament to the richness and stability of their environment, now became a vulnerability. The vast quantities of vegetation needed to sustain a single large herbivore became scarce as plants struggled in the dimmer, cooler conditions. Ferns wilted, ancient conifers shed their needles, and even the newer flowering plants suffered under the persistent twilight. The food chains, built upon this foundation of abundant plant life, began to unravel from the bottom up. Carnivores who hunted the great herbivores found their prey dwindling. Even smaller dinosaurs, adapted to specific niches, found those niches vanishing. Their eggs, perhaps needing steady warmth, grew cold. It wasn't a weakness in them, but rather that the stage upon which their lives played out had been fundamentally, irrevocably altered. The rules changed too quickly for such specialized, large forms to adapt. The long, warm afternoon had ended, and the cool, uncertain twilight proved too harsh for the sun-loving giants. They faded, not in a single, dramatic moment, but gradually, inevitably, like figures receding into a deepening mist, leaving behind only their bones and footprints as echoes of their long reign. But life, the grand story insists, is persistent. It finds a way. All through the age of giants, other, much smaller stories had been unfolding, often unnoticed, in the shadows, under the roots of giant ferns, in the cool of the night. Small creatures, covered in fur, with warm blood coursing through their veins, had existed alongside the dinosaurs for millions of years. They were mammals, our distant ancestors. Timid, perhaps, living cautiously in a world ruled by giants. Many were likely nocturnal, their senses of smell and hearing highly developed, navigating the world by scent and sound in the darkness, while the great reptiles slept. They were small, requiring far less food than a dinosaur, able to survive on insects, seeds, perhaps the occasional fallen fruit or unguarded egg. Their warm blood gave them an advantage in the cooling climate, allowing them to remain active when reptiles grew sluggish. Many burrowed, seeking shelter underground, a habit that might have offered some protection from the initial catastrophe and the harsh conditions that followed. As the dust began to settle, literally and figuratively, over months, years, decades, the world that emerged was quieter, emptier, cooler. The giant shapes were gone. The overwhelming presence that had defined the landscape for an age had vanished. And into this changed world, cautiously at first, the small, furry creatures began to venture. Imagine them, tiny shrew-like beings sniffing the air at the entrance of a burrow, larger possum, like climbers exploring the lower branches of the surviving trees, finding a world free from the giant predators that had hunted their ancestors. The niches left vacant by the dinosaurs were vast. It wasn't an instantaneous takeover, not a sudden explosion of new forms. Evolution works more slowly, more patiently than that. But the opportunity was there. The pressure was off. These small mammals, adaptable and resilient, found a world brimming with potential. With fewer large predators, they could explore more freely, forage more widely. They could become active during the day as well as the night. The surviving plants, including those adaptable flowering plants, offered new food sources. Slowly, generation by generation, they began to diversify. Natural selection favored those individuals better suited to the new conditions. Some grew slightly larger. Some adapted to eating different kinds of food: leaves, fruits, insects, perhaps eventually other small vertebrates. Some developed adaptations for running, climbing, swimming, digging. The basic mammalian blueprint, warm-blooded, fur-covered, milk-producing, often highly adaptable, proved remarkably successful in this post-dinosaur world. This was the quiet change, the dawn that followed the long twilight. It wasn't heralded by trumpets or marked by grand monuments. It happened in the undergrowth, in the burrows, in the quiet forests recovering under a slowly clearing sky. It was the gentle emergence of a different kind of life, smaller, perhaps less immediately spectacular than the dinosaurs, but adaptable, resourceful, and carrying within it the seeds of future complexity. The Earth, once the domain of giant reptiles basking in perpetual warmth, was slowly, quietly becoming the domain of the mammals. The air might have felt cooler, thinner, the landscape perhaps less dramatic initially, but it was alive with new possibilities, a new chapter opening in the grand, unfolding story of life. The silence left by the giants was gradually being filled by the rustling, scurrying, chattering sounds of these new inheritors, exploring a world remade, stepping out into the light of a new day. The age of giants had passed, gently, irrevocably, making way for a different kind of dawn. The world continued its slow recovery, bathed in the softer light of this new mammalian age. Vast forests began to reclaim the land, stretching green arms towards the sky. Ferns unfurled in the damp undergrowth, and flowering plants, relative newcomers themselves in the grand sweep of time, painted the landscape with tentative splashes of color. These weren't the stark, ancient forests of giant cycads and conifers that the dinosaurs knew, but increasingly complex, layered ecosystems woven through with vines, dappled with sunlight filtering through broad leaves, humming with the quiet industry of insects. It was a world brimming with niches, with hidden pathways, with opportunities for those small, warm-blooded creatures that had inherited the earth. And so, from the forest floor, where many continued to rustle through the leaf litter, finding sustenance and safety in the shadows, some mammals began to look upwards. Perhaps it started with a simple scramble to escape a predator, a tentative climb onto a low-hanging branch. Perhaps it was the lure of ripe fruit hanging just out of reach, or the enticing buzz of insects dancing higher up amongst the leaves. Whatever the initial impulse, generation after generation, certain groups found themselves spending more and more time away from the solid ground, venturing into the complex, three-dimensional world of the canopy. Life in the trees was different. It offered refuge, a different menu of foods, and a vantage point from which to see the world. But it also presented unique challenges. The ground is predictable, mostly flat. The canopy, however, is a shifting, intricate lattice of branches, twigs, and leaves. It demands balance, a secure grip, and the ability to judge distances accurately. A misstep here doesn't mean a stumble, it could mean a fall. Natural selection, that quiet, patient sculptor, began to favor adaptations suited to this arboreal realm. Among these aspiring tree dwellers was a lineage of small, perhaps nocturnal mammals, likely not much larger than a squirrel. They were probably still primarily insect eaters, maybe supplementing their diet with the sweet pulp of early fruits or the tender buds of new leaves. They scurried along branches, their sharp claws providing purchase on the rough bark, much like many small mammals do today. But within this group, Subtle changes were beginning to accumulate, nudged along by the demands of their chosen home. Imagine tiny hands, paws that were slowly becoming more than just anchors. Claws, excellent for digging or clinging to sheer surfaces, are less ideal for securely grasping a narrow, flexible branch or for manipulating a piece of fruit to find the best part. Over immense stretches of time, in some of these creatures, the sharp, curved claws began to recede on some digits, replaced by flatter nails. Beneath these nails, the pads of the fingers and toes became more sensitive, developing intricate patterns of ridges, fingerprints, that increased friction and provided a wealth of tactile information. These weren't yet the nimble hands of later primates, but they were the beginning. Fingers gained a little more independence, the ability to curl around a twig, to feel the texture of bark, the smoothness of a leaf, the ripeness of a berry. The world, for these creatures, was becoming something not just to cling to, but something to hold, to explore with touch. Think of a tiny creature, pausing on a branch, carefully rotating a newly found beetle, feeling its shape before eating it. A small act, repeated millions of times over millennia, reflecting a growing connection between hand and brain. At the same time, another subtle but profound shift was occurring in how these animals perceived their world. For many mammals living on the ground, eyes positioned on the sides of the head are advantageous. They provide a wide, panoramic view, excellent for detecting predators approaching from almost any direction. But in the complex, cluttered world of the trees, this wide view is less critical than judging exactly how far away the next branch is. Leaping through the canopy requires precision. A slight miscalculation in distance could be disastrous. Slowly, incrementally, the eyes of these proto-primates began to migrate from the sides of the head towards the front. This change narrowed the total field of view, but it allowed the vision from each eye to overlap significantly. This overlap was the key to unlocking a new way of seeing, stereoscopic vision or depth perception. The brain, receiving slightly different images from each eye, could compute the distance to objects with remarkable accuracy. The world, once perhaps a flatter panorama, snapped into 3 dimensions. Branches now had not just direction, but distance. Gaps could be judged. The path through the intricate network of the forest canopy became clearer, safer to navigate. This new visual acuity wasn't just for locomotion, it was also invaluable for spotting food, the well-camouflaged insect, the fruit hidden amongst the leaves, and for detecting predators lurking in the dappled light. Imagine the world through these evolving eyes, a richer, deeper, more detailed tapestry, where every leaf, every branch, occupied a precise place in space. This increasingly complex, 3-dimensional world, navigated by touch and precise vision, demanded more sophisticated processing. Living in the trees wasn't just a physical challenge, it was a mental one. Remembering the locations of reliable fruit trees, knowing which insects were safe to eat, learning the safest routes through the branches, understanding the subtle signs of danger, all these tasks favored individuals with slightly better memories, slightly quicker learning abilities, slightly more developed brains relative to their body size. Curiosity became a valuable trait. The creature that explored a new type of plant, tasted a new fruit, or investigated a strange crevice in the bark might discover a new food source or a safer hiding place. This wasn't conscious, analytical thought as we know it, but a gentle, persistent inquisitiveness, a drive to interact with and learn about the environment. The brain, stimulated by this constant influx of sensory information and the need to make complex decisions about movement and sustenance, began, ever so slowly, to grow more complex. Neural pathways formed, strengthened by repeated experiences. Memory improved. The capacity for learning, for associating cause and effect, gradually expanded. These weren't philosophers contemplating the universe, but small beings intensely engaged with the immediate realities of their arboreal lives, their minds subtly sharpening with each passing generation. The forest became a symphony of sensations for these evolving creatures. The damp scent of moss after rain, the sweet perfume of night-blooming flowers attracting moths, the sharp tang of resin oozing from bark. The sounds, too, were rich. The drone of cicadas, the chirping calls of other forest dwellers, the rustle of leaves indicating movement nearby, the drip of water, the snap of a twig, Their sensitive fingers felt the rough texture of bark, the cool smoothness of a waxy leaf, the delicate structure of an insect's wing, the soft fur of a companion. And their increasingly sharp, forward-facing eyes drank in the play of light and shadow, the myriad shades of green, the bright flashes of color from fruits and flowers, the subtle movements that betrayed a hidden creature. Their world was intimate, detailed, and engaging. It's likely, too, that these creatures were becoming more social, living in close proximity, perhaps in small family groups or foraging pairs, created opportunities for interaction and learning from one another. A younger individual might watch an elder successfully pry open a tough seed pod or avoid a particular type of poisonous caterpillar. This wasn't formal teaching, but simple observation and imitation, a basic form of cultural transmission that could pass beneficial behaviors through a population more quickly than genetic change alone. Vocalizations, perhaps simple chirps or clicks, might have served to maintain contact, signal danger, or express contentment. These burgeoning social bonds added another layer of complexity to their lives, another stimulus for mental development. All of this unfolded with the unhurried pace of deep time. There were no sudden transformations, no overnight leaps in intelligence or dexterity. Each adaptation was a tiny refinement, favored because it offered a slight edge in survival and reproduction within the specific context of the forest canopy. For millions upon millions of years, these small, clever creatures lived amongst the trees, their hands becoming more adept, their vision sharper, their minds quietly growing more curious and capable. They were exploring not just the physical space of the forest, but the very potential held within the mammalian form. Unbeknownst to them, they were laying the groundwork, deep within the quiet green cathedrals of the recovering earth, for futures they could not possibly imagine, patiently weaving the first threads of a lineage that would, eventually, look down from the branches and wonder about the world beyond. The rustling in the leaves wasn't just the sound of small animals anymore, it was the sound of potential, gathering quietly in the heart of the forest. The quiet rustling in the leaves continued, season after season blending into millennia, an endless, patient whisper through the green corridors of the world. Deep within those ancient forests, the potential gathered, a quiet hum of becoming, but the world itself was never static. The slow, immense breathing of the planet continued, continents drifting almost imperceptibly, climates shifting over ages that dwarf imagination. In some parts of the world, the dense, unbroken canopy began to thin. Perhaps the rains came less reliably for a few centuries, or the air grew subtly cooler. Forests retreated in places, giving way to landscapes where sunlight fell more freely on the ground, where trees stood further apart, interspersed with open woodlands or wide, grassy plains that stretched towards the horizon like a tawny sea. For the descendants of those small, clever creatures of the trees, this changing world presented a different kind of puzzle, a new set of questions asked not in thought, but in the daily rhythm of survival. The familiar highways of the branches sometimes ended now, petering out into open space. Food sources might be scattered further apart, requiring journeys across exposed ground, away from the immediate safety of the high canopy. And so, tentatively at first, almost reluctantly, some began to spend more time closer to the earth. Perhaps it began with brief excursions, darting from one patch of woodland to the next, eyes wide, scanning the unfamiliar openness for shadows that moved too quickly. The ground felt different beneath their sensitive hands and feet, sometimes soft with fallen leaves, sometimes hard-packed earth, sometimes prickly with dry grasses. They were still creatures of the trees, retreating upwards at the slightest alarm, their bodies perfectly attuned to grasping and climbing. But the lure of sustenance, or perhaps just the need to reach the next safe haven, drew them down more often, for longer periods. Over countless generations, this subtle shift began to leave its mark. Imagine standing hesitantly at the edge of the woods, peering out across a sun-drenched savanna. Rising up slightly on the hind limbs, just for a moment, might offer a better view over the tall grasses, a glimpse of distant trees, or the flick of a predator's tail. It wasn't a conscious decision, just a small movement, repeated time and again, that offered a tiny advantage. Those individuals whose hip structure or leg muscles made this momentary elevation slightly easier, slightly more stable, might have been fractionally better at spotting danger or finding food. And in the slow calculus of evolution, fractions matter. Slowly, painstakingly slowly, posture began to change. The spine adapted, curving gently to better support an upright stance. The pelvis broadened, providing a more stable anchor for leg muscles, now used not just for climbing, but for bearing the body's full weight. Feet, once primarily grasping tools, began to reshape, the big toe aligning more with the others, the arch developing to absorb the shock of walking on the ground. This wasn't a sudden leap to striding confidently across the plains. It was a gradual, hesitant straightening, a slow accommodation to spending more time navigating the world on 2 feet instead of 4. And as these beings began to walk more upright, something wonderful happened. Their hands, already so adept from millions of years spent navigating the complex, 3-dimensional world of the forest canopy, were freed. They were no longer needed quite so constantly for locomotion on the ground. Now, they could carry things. Imagine the simple, profound change, carrying precious food back to a safer place to eat, or perhaps carrying a dependent infant, allowing the group to move together more easily. These freed hands could explore textures in a new way, could manipulate objects with greater focus. A smooth, heavy stone found by a dry riverbed might feel interesting, might, with a lucky strike, crack open a stubborn nut that jaws alone could not. A fallen branch, stripped of its leaves, might be useful for probing into termite mounds or warding off a curious scavenger. These weren't tools in the way we think of them now, not deliberately crafted implements, but rather found objects, extensions of the hand, used in fleeting moments of opportunity or need. The potential held within those sensitive fingers, those opposable thumbs, was slowly beginning to find new expression on the open landscapes. Life on the ground brought new challenges that favored different kinds of thinking. Predators were perhaps larger, swifter, harder to escape than those in the trees. Food sources like roots, tubers, or scattered fruits required different search strategies. Living in more open environments might also have encouraged larger group sizes for safety and cooperation. Finding food and avoiding danger became tasks perhaps better solved together. Sharing information, a gesture pointing towards water, a specific cry indicating a certain type of predator, became increasingly valuable. The simple chirps and clicks of the forest dwellers might have gradually elaborated, becoming more nuanced, capable of conveying more complex meanings. Social bonds, already present, likely deepened. Cooperation in hunting small game, or in defending the group against threats, would have favored those who could understand each other, anticipate needs, and work together. The brain, that intricate organ, was gently stimulated by these new complexities, the demands of navigating wider territories, the intricacies of social interactions, the challenge of using found objects in helpful ways. It grew, slowly, generation by generation, not in sudden bursts, but in subtle expansions of areas related to planning, communication, and fine motor control. Then came another shift, imperceptible in any single lifetime but transformative over epochs. The simple act of using a found stone began to evolve. Perhaps one stone was accidentally struck against another, and a sharp flake broke off. It might have been discarded, unnoticed. But perhaps, eventually, the connection was made. Striking stones together could create a sharper edge. An edge better suited for scraping meat from a bone, or for cutting through tough plant fibers. This wasn't invention as a sudden flash of insight, but a dawning awareness, built upon countless small observations and experiments over thousands of years. Imagine the quiet patience involved, selecting the right kind of stone, learning through trial and error the precise angle and force needed to shape it. The feel of the stone in the hand, the sharp crack as a flake sheared away, the satisfaction of creating something useful, however crude. Knowledge like this, hard-won, could be passed down, perhaps through simple imitation, the young watching the old, replicating their movements. These first deliberately shaped tools, rough-hewn choppers and scrapers, represent a profound cognitive leap, the ability to see not just what an object is, but what it could become. And somewhere in this unfolding story, fire entered the picture. At first, it must have been a terrifying force of nature, the aftermath of a lightning strike, a wildfire sweeping across the savanna, consuming everything in its path. Something to be feared, fled from. But fire also offered warmth. It offered light in the darkness. Predators seemed wary of it. And perhaps, after a fire had passed, scavenging was easier. Cooked carcasses might have been found, the meat strangely tender, easier to chew and digest. Tentatively, perhaps, a burning branch left behind by a natural fire might have been approached. Maybe embers were carried carefully, kept alive in dry leaves or dung, tended with cautious curiosity, learning to control fire, to keep it going, and eventually, millennia later, to make it at will, perhaps by striking sparks from certain stones or through the friction of rubbing wood, was a monumental step. Fire changed everything. It provided warmth against the chill of night, safety from creatures that stalked the darkness. It allowed food to be cooked, unlocking nutrients and making it safer to eat. It became a focal point, a gathering place where the group could share the day's experiences, huddle together, feel a sense of shared security and belonging unlike anything before. The flickering light pushed back the immense darkness of the world, and in its glow, perhaps, new kinds of connections were forged. With freed hands, more complex tools, the gift of fire, and brains slowly growing in capacity, communication continued to blossom. The grunts, gestures, and calls became more elaborate, capable of expressing finer shades of meaning, coordinating more complex activities, sharing knowledge more effectively. Perhaps simple narratives began to emerge around the flickering flames, recounting the day's hunt, warning about dangers, remembering paths to water sources. Language, in its nascent forms, allowed for planning, for teaching the young not just by imitation, but through instruction. It allowed for the sharing of memories, the building of a collective understanding of the world, and with language came the ability to ask questions, to wonder. Armed with these emerging skills, the ability to walk long distances, to create tools, to control fire, to cooperate in groups, and to communicate complex ideas, these hominins began to explore. It wasn't a planned conquest, but a slow, generational drift, following herds of animals, seeking new resources as climates shifted, driven perhaps by simple curiosity about what lay beyond the next valley, the next horizon. Over tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, they spread outwards from their ancestral African homelands, adapting to new environments, colder climates, denser forests, coastal regions, high mountains. Each new landscape presented unique challenges, prompting further innovation, further adaptation. They learned to make warmer clothing from animal hides, developed new hunting techniques, found new plants to eat, built different kinds of shelters. The journey was immense, undertaken not by individuals, but by the slow, relentless expansion of populations over deep time. And somewhere along this journey, another profound change began to stir, the dawn of self-awareness, of symbolic thought. We see glimpses of it in the archaeological record, the deliberate burial of the dead, sometimes accompanied by simple grave goods, suggesting a nascent awareness of mortality, perhaps a belief in something beyond the physical. We see it in the first tentative expressions of art, patterns scratched onto ochre, shells pierced to be worn as beads, and eventually, the breathtaking paintings adorning the walls of deep caves, depicting the animals that shared their world with such vividness and skill. These weren't just about survival anymore. They spoke of a mind capable of abstract thought, of appreciating beauty, of reflecting on its own existence and its place within the wider world. They were asking not just how to live, but perhaps beginning to ponder why. Looking up at the vast sweep of the night sky, the same stars we see tonight, perhaps they felt the first stirrings of wonder, of awe, of the profound mystery of being. This, then, is the beginning of our own chapter in the grand story of life. It's a very recent chapter, written on just the last few pages of an immense, ancient volume. We carry within us the legacy of that entire story, the resilience of the first cells, the diversification in the ancient oceans, the journey onto land, the adaptation to the forests, the hesitant steps onto the savanna, the journey from those small, furry creatures in the trees to beings who could walk upright, shape stone, harness fire, speak complex languages, and contemplate the universe was incredibly long. shaped by the slow, patient hand of evolution acting on countless generations. And the story, of course, is far from over. Evolution hasn't stopped. It continues its quiet work within us and around us, in every living thing. We are a part of this ongoing narrative, shaped by the immense journey that came before, and now, with our growing awareness and technological capacity, beginning to shape the future chapters in ways no species has before. The potential that gathered quietly in the heart of the forest all those eons ago has blossomed into consciousness, into curiosity, into the ability to look back and try to understand the incredible path life has taken. As the world settles into quietness for the night, remember that this vast, unfolding story continues, whispering through time, a story of connection, transformation, and enduring life, of which we are simply the current, wandering in her,